Okay, so I'm going to introduce our speaker for today, Roger Lowenstein, who is an American financial journalist and graduate of Cornell University. And he reported for the Wall Street Journal for more than a decade. His work appeared in the Wall Street Journal, appeared in not only the Wall Street Journal, but Bloomberg, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Fortune, Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, and other publications. Roger's books include the New York Times bestseller Buffett, When Genius Failed and the End of Wall Street, and the critically acclaimed Origins of the Crash While America Aged, and America's Bank. Of course, his latest book, which we'll be discussing tonight, is concerning Abraham Lincoln, of course. Now, Roger has 3 children. He lives with his wife, Judy, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Tennant Harbor, Maine. And I should mention that his late father was a Columbia Law School professor, and the reason I mention that, besides Roger, is that my daughter-in-law is also a Columbia Law School professor. So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Roger.
Thank you, John. Thank you, David. Thanks to all of you for coming. It's a pleasure to be here at the Lincoln Group of Washington, D.C. I know you all know a lot about Lincoln. I'm hoping to tell you something about an aspect of him maybe you haven't focused on. My first Lincoln book, over here it is, Ways and Means. And I'm a financial specialist. All my books have been about financial history and some have been about current events. I got into this because in a previous book about the Federal Reserve, the creation of the Federal Reserve, I came to know the system that the Fed replaced, which was actually set up during the Civil War. And I was astonished that so much financial innovation had happened during that time. And obviously, Lincoln and all the cabinet members and so on had so much else to do. And they did a lot else besides fight battles. And even more than fight battles and emancipate the slaves, which I'm going to talk about tonight. And they started from nothing. The government of the United States had, in 1860, was very close to the Jeffersonian ideal of the government governs least. There were a couple of thousand civil bureaucrats in Washington, about 15,000 soldiers, mostly spread amongst the forts west of the Mississippi. There was really hardly any civil government to speak of. In a financial sense, there was no tax system. The revenue was raised by a system of tariffs. Of course, once the war started, trade dried up, so that went away. There were no national banks. We've read a lot about, in recent weeks, about the bank collapse in the Silicon Valley, the West Coast, and a couple of others. Did they or didn't they follow the rules? Well, those rules didn't exist until the Civil War. There hadn't been any system of national regulators. Anyway, there was none of that. There was no central bank, and perhaps most surprisingly, there was no national money. If you lived in New York, a local bank might issue a note, and you could carry it around, and that might circulate. Same thing if you lived in, say, Ohio. But if you try to travel from Ohio into Pennsylvania, certainly to New York with one of those local notes, you might not get very far. So every state had its own series of notes. There were thousands of them all told. I think it's fair to say that in a financial sense, there was no union. This presented a tremendous challenge when the war started. Everybody expected that it would be a short war, like everybody expects all wars would be short wars. But nonetheless, they had to finance it, and there was no apparent means. So Salmon Chase, who was one of the 2 big figures, main figures in the book, he was the Secretary of the Treasury, the other one is Lincoln. He looked at what had been done in previous wars and decided to copy that. What happened in previous wars was the Treasury would go to the big local banks and ask to borrow money from them. And the War of 1812, Mexican-American War, and so on. And in that way, raise funds to fight the war. Chase knew that, even expecting a short war, this was going to be on a bigger scale than ever seen before. So he went to the banks that mattered, the banks with funds, and they were based in 3 cities, in New York and Philadelphia and Boston. And he asked to borrow $50 million in gold. Actually, he wanted to do that several times over, but the idea was he would borrow the gold, they would spend it on soldiers' pay and uniforms and bullets and so on. The manufacturers who got that gold would redeposit it, and then the banks would be able to lend it back. But they were going to start with $50 million in gold. The banks were horrified. These banks had a total of about $60 million in gold. That's it. And to lend $50 million, that seemed pretty steep. So they immediately came up with a compromise to Chase. They said, why don't we lend you our notes? And we'll just leave the gold right here in our safe. It could be the basis of the circulation. Chase had nothing doing. He was a gold bug. He was a little stubborn. And through the persuasive powers of representing the Treasury during wartime, he convinced the banks, very grudgingly, to lend $50 million in gold. When this deal was concluded, agreed upon, there was a celebratory dinner at the Willard Hotel, right downtown in Washington, the scene of many famous Civil War scenes. And John Stevens, who was the president of the Bank of Commerce, the biggest bank in New York, the biggest bank in the country, sort of lead banker, got up and he said, Mr. Chase, we've just agreed to lend to you the august sum of $50 million. That should be quite enough to fight your war. Don't come back. So I can tell you that before the war was over, the Union would spend that sum 60 times over. 60 times over. And the main story of the book is how Chase raised the other 59 times. Chase and Lincoln really deferred to Chase on financial matters. He got involved when he had to. They had an enormously productive marriage. Like some other marriages that are productive, it wasn't a particularly happy marriage. Chase was one of those discontented rivals to the throne. He had also competed for the nomination for the Republican Party in 1860. Of course, he was from Ohio. Lincoln and Chase didn't meet until after the election. Lincoln had great respect for Chase, who was a noted anti-slavery lawyer and warrior, and much more active in the anti-slavery struggle than Lincoln had been before the war. Lincoln knew he wanted Chase for Secretary of the Treasury due to his intelligence and incisiveness, but he had a small problem, which was that his floor managers in Chicago at the convention, Republican convention, had already promised the job to Simon Cameron in Pennsylvania, which is a swing state, very important. The problem with Simon Cameron was he was completely corrupt. And Lincoln figured he could take care of that, but in any case, on New Year's Eve, 1860, he sent a telegram to Chase. Lincoln was in Springfield summoning his cabinet, and asked Chase if Chase could come out from Ohio to see him. Chase took, I think it was 4 railroads, 2 days to get there. He gets to Springfield, and he leaves his card with the Lincolns, tells him he will look in on the Lincolns after he's rested up. Abe comes bounding over immediately to see Chase, slaps him on the back, he's so happy to see him and everything. Chase, who's still not by any means over the fact that the president-elect is Lincoln, not himself. He's a little taken aback by this show, what he regards as not quite his due respect. Lincoln immediately makes matters worse. He says, I've called in Springfield to see if you would accept, if you'd be prepared to accept the job of Secretary of the Treasury. However, I'm not prepared to offer it to you yet. This certainly wasn't what Chase had taken 4 railroads to hear. Finally, as they get close to March 4th, when Lincoln, of course, inaugurated, Lincoln finds another position for Simon Cameron, not an insignificant one, the Secretary of War, but he's got to stick him someplace for a while. He's ready to offer the job to Chase, and Chase makes a great show of saying, well, I don't know if I can take this, I'm busy doing other things in the Senate, but Lincoln just sends his name up. And they have this, this sort of prickliness survives in their relationship. The Battle of Bull Run happens, of course, the first Union disaster. Chase immediately, when he sees an article in a newspaper criticizing the administration's role from in it, he's thoughtful enough to clip the article, send it to Lincoln, and scribble across the top, "This has too much truth in it." So he's always looking for ways to make Lincoln's job a little bit worse. He really vacillates between feeling tremendously wounded at what he perceives as Lincoln's not paying him significant attention and so on, and between conspiring against him. When Chase is feeling ignored, which happens 3 or 4 times to an extreme, he'll offer his resignation. And Lincoln will go over, pat him on the back, now, take this back, we need you, we want you, and so on. When Chase is sort of not feeling ignored, he'll be conspiring against Lincoln, meeting with dissident generals, raising up hackles in the Senate among Republicans who feel that Lincoln isn't radical enough, and so on, and causing all sorts of troubles. And writing comments to people as the war moves on, such as the one in his letters where he said, the next president will need qualities different from those of the current president. And he adds risibly, "I'm not anxious to be considered as someone who has those qualities." Of course, it's quite obvious to Lincoln that he's anxious only to be considered as a contender. People begin to warn Lincoln that his own Treasury Secretary is conspiring against him. Mary says, "You better watch it." Lincoln says, "Oh, mother," he calls her mother, says, "Oh, mother, you're too suspicious," and sort of makes light of it. He says, sort of laughingly, that presidential ambition is a maggot which has bored its way into Chase's brain. And using another one of these farmhouse metaphors, he compares Chase's ambition to the chin fly of a horse, which makes it kick up and rear, but also gets it to pull the plow all the harder. Even when Chase was secretly planning to campaign against Lincoln for the 1864 nomination, even when his secret plot is exposed, and Chase, of course, it's terribly awkward to have this part of the cabinet, he's forced to offer his resignation. Lincoln, with the magnanimity for which he's deservedly known, thinks about it, lets Chase stew for a week or so, and says that as for his offer of resignation, he'll judge that only in the public merit, and he sees no reason to change. And so you wonder, why does Lincoln put up with all this? I mean, the reason is Chase is just doing a terrific job at a really vital area, which is, you've heard the expression that money is the sinews of war, and that's Chase's bailiwick. Along with a couple of key members in Congress, he designs the first tax system the United States has ever had. This is a hugely comprehensive bill. It taxes income, the first serious income tax, the first income tax of any sort in the United States, the first serious one really in the world. Britain had a very modest experiment in income taxes. It taxes professional incomes, it taxes stock and bond incomes. It taxes, as one contemporary said, everything under the sun and under the earth as well. And it really gives the Union a financial strength that the South could only dream of. He creates a system of national banks, as I alluded to before, the first time that federal regulations govern what sort of reserves banks would have, what sort of notes they would circulate. They were all uniform. It was very much, it was not only important to the war, it became the cornerstone of the Industrial Revolution, the financing of the Industrial Revolution after the war. And most important of all, he creates the first national money. And these are the famous greenbacks. They're not only national, they're the same greenbacks circulated in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, New York, and around the Union. But they're the first fiat money that the country's ever had, meaning there's no gold behind them, there's no silver behind them, they're not exchangeable for metal. They're money only because the United States government says legally they're money. And this may not sound like much today because that's the stuff that's in our wallets. But back then it was shocking. In fact, there were great debates about the legal tender bill, even among Lincoln's own party, the Republicans. One congressman at the time said that paper can't be real money. Paper is no more money than a contract to deliver flour is flour itself. It's just the promise to deliver the real thing. But Chase knew that he needed paper because there simply wasn't enough gold to go around. Those bankers hadn't been wrong. The scale of the financing dwarfed the supply of gold coins, which at any moment in time was essentially random. And not only did it circulate, they were worried would people accept this, it's just paper. People loved it. And not only did it circulate in the North, but to Jefferson Davis's chagrin, it circulated in the South too. The Union troops would go into some occupied town, Memphis or Nashville or someplace. They'd go into the stores, the places they were occupied, they'd be there for a while, and bit by bit the currency would circulate into the South. The merchants there weren't dumb. They knew that this money was better than the notes that the South was circulating. This financial system that Chase was the architect of, the national banks, the taxation system, and legal tender gave the Union just unmatched financial strength, and it made possible a fourth leg, if you will, of the Union's financial prowess. It gave people confidence in the financial strength of the Union and allowed Chase to launch the first national bond drives. He went to just ordinary people in large cities and small towns across the Union and raised just prodigious sums, ultimately $2 billion, which in those era was an enormous sum of money, collecting the savings of people who now had faith that there was something behind the Union finances. And this gave the Union a financial strength that the South envied and tried to emulate, but never got close to replicating. All these financial innovations were part, but only part of what I call in the book a real revolution in government. I said at the top that before the Civil War, before Lincoln, the federal government barely existed, and all that really changed under Lincoln. It began with some of the financial measures, but it went much beyond that. For Lincoln, the acid test of a democracy was whether it was delivering opportunity to all people. He also saw it in economic terms. Was it delivering a chance to rise up for people such as himself, who of course had started with nothing? And even during the depths of the Civil War, when he had so much else going on, Lincoln stayed focused on this ambition of his, which had been his ambition, had been the reason he entered government as a young man in the Illinois legislature. I'm just going to read you something that he wrote. This is in 1861. It's the first time he speaks to the Congress, July 4th, as it was, 1861, a special session. He calls the Congress in to raise an emergency measure, men, troops, and finances. But even in that moment, you'll see that he's thinking of the bigger picture of why he wants to win the war, why it's so important to him that the Union and democracy, American democracy, persevere. So I say in the book that while Lincoln faced the challenges of the war, he also had in mind a broader purpose: to cohere the Union to a stronger whole. He needed to strengthen the Union to fight the war, but also to serve the agenda for which, as a young man, he had entered politics. To Lincoln, the test of a democracy was that it provided the people a better shot at advancing on the economic ladder. And you can hear in his words the economic lens through which he projects this. And now I'll quote. So this is Lincoln on July 4th, 1861, to Congress. Quote, "This is essentially a people's contest. On the side of the Union, it is the struggle for maintaining in the world that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life." No doubt about what Lincoln's thinking and what his aims are. And then, despite the fact that the war was going on, they went out and did it. And you're all familiar with the New Deal and the raft of legislation that was passed then. But there really was an antecedent to the New Deal in the Congress of the Civil War period. One of the first bill that they passed, I think, in this vein was the Homestead Act, which is just a straight bill for upward mobility. The idea was, if you're willing to farm and improve a piece of land for 5 years, you were deeded 160 acres. You know, just as an American idea, I think you could possibly conjure. Ultimately, millions and millions of people got land this way. Ultimately, 10% of the United States, including much of Alaska, were deeded this way. Another Lincoln Opportunity Bill. We hear a lot today about infrastructure and Build Back Better. Well, Lincoln was very much into infrastructure, and he got passed the mother of all infrastructure bills at that time, the Transcontinental Railroad. Like the Homestead Act, that had been debated for years, but never passed. And the Transcontinental Railroad really binded the country, not just economically and physically, but psychologically. There had actually been fears as the South seceded that there'd be other little mini secessions, and that even California would secede, because really, what do they have to do with the civilization across 1,500 miles of mostly barren plains? The railroad bound them together in a way that could never be severed. I think my favorite of all of these bills was the Morrill Land Grant College Act. It was named for Justin Morrill, a Vermont congressman who regretted the fact that his father didn't have the money to send him to college. He became a store clerk. He actually used some of his savings or some of his profits to invest very profitably. He became a very wealthy man, built a beautiful library up in Vermont. He continued to live. But he always regretted not going to college. And the idea of this bill wasn't to found expensive colleges for rich kids, like the ones that Morrill had been able to afford, but middle-class colleges that would teach not just Latin and theology and maybe a smattering of medicine, but engineering and the practical arts. And they would be financed by gifts of endowments of federal land, and then be affordable to the great middle class. This is a time when not more than 1%, not even 1% of the country attended college. And of course, the Union was fighting this terrible war. Morrill had a great deal of trouble getting it through. He said this is a bill that will produce benefits for the ages and harms nobody. I'm sure that there are people in this room who went to land-grant colleges. I did it at Cornell, and I think it really was a bill that harmed nobody and produced benefits for the ages. In fact, I have trouble thinking of a piece of legislation that did more good and was more of a leveler than the bills that created not just Cornell, Michigan State, colleges in Oregon, and eventually colleges in the South, and so on, public universities. I said that was my favorite of the bills. Lincoln was behind all these bills, but I think his was actually for the Department of Agriculture. We have, I was going to say we had one veteran in the Department of Agriculture. I lived there, we actually have two. We had an internship. The idea of the Department of Agriculture, because it was the first department that dealt with a particular industry, that dealt with the private economy. It was very Lincolnian in that sense, the idea that the government should assume any responsibility for the economic fortunes of any part of the country. And the idea was based in Lincoln's upbringing in rural and frontier areas of Indiana and Illinois, that farmers in these areas, much more than say farmers in Massachusetts, where it was thickly settled relative to the cities, could use education in seeds, the latest techniques, and all of that. And he said he considered it to be the people's department. He expected that it would have an intimate relationship with individual farmers. This also was proposed before the war, before Lincoln took office. It's interesting to contrast his view of it with that of one of the prime opponents, who was Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis had also been born in Kentucky, also in a log cabin, nicer than Lincoln's log cabin, but it's a log cabin, about 100 miles away, a year before Abe Lincoln was born. Of course, they took different paths, the families from there. And Thomas Lincoln, although not really literate in any real sense, had a profound dislike for slavery, and Abraham always credited that as one of the reasons why the family moved north to Indiana. The Davises moved south, ultimately Mississippi. His brother became a wealthy planter and gifted Jefferson Davis to a cotton plantation. He then became even wealthier as a cotton planter, and of course a senator from Mississippi, an ardent secessionist. But before secession, when the idea of agriculture was proposed, Davis rejected it with a very unforgettable phrase. He said, "Farming needs no teaching by Congress. Farming needs no teaching by Congress." And he was right, if your brother gave you a cotton plantation. I really think these two contrasting views of government tell you a whole lot about what was going on in the North in contrast to what was going on in the South. Not just in the issue, the paramount issue of slavery, of course, but also in how these two political cultures viewed even the mass of citizens within their own territories. After all, the mass of whites, great majority of whites in the South, didn't own slaves. They weren't rich like Jefferson Davis's brother or Jefferson Davis. But Jefferson Davis wasn't looking out for them either. This philosophy was also expressed by Joseph Brown, the governor of Georgia at the time of secession. The Confederate leaders were all very nervous about whether or not the common man would go along with them. Because after all, if the main reason for secession was to protect slavery, which I believe it was, and the average Southerner, or the majority of Southerners didn't own slaves, what was going to get Johnny Reb to carry a musket? And what Governor Brown of Georgia said in answering that question was, the poor man's best government is slavery. The poor man's best government is slavery. Not railroads, not homesteads, not colleges, not a new tax system, but slavery. What he meant, of course, was as long as there are black slaves, you, the poor whites, will at least be one rung up from the bottom. And I think this, this really defines the difference between the philosophies of the North and South, again, which began with slavery but extended to much more than slavery. It extended to a whole notion of government, in Lincoln's view, existing to serve all the people and to create opportunity for all the people. And in the South, so obviously not. In the book, I argue that these differences, including the North's vastly superior finances, were as much or maybe even more responsible for the North's victory than its generals and troops. Certainly the South had no deficit in terms of the quality of its generals or the valor of its soldiers. They fought valiantly for longer than anyone expected they would have. And some of you in this room, I'm sure, know more about that than I do, but they fought long and hard. But from very early in the war, their finances began to cripple them. I can give you one set of figures. As the North was creating these new mechanisms, including the greenbacks, everybody was very worried about inflation. The North did suffer inflation, about 80% over the course of the war. 80% over the course of the war. Well, inflation in the South was 9,000%. I won't ask you to take out a calculator and figure out what happened to the price of bread, but you'll understand when you hear that why, as the South was finally succumbing, one of the Southern leaders said, we weren't beaten on the field. The Yankees whipped us in the Treasury Department. So thank you very much. Questions? John?
Yeah, wasn't one of the reasons that they were so successful with the bonds financing Jay Cook to sell the bonds, basically. He
Yes.
had an entire network. He sent people out door to door peddling these bonds.
Yes, Chase contracted with a very modest Jay Cook to sell bonds door to door. Cook was extremely successful. He later compared himself to Moses and Jesus. And he was so successful that after the war, he tried to do the same thing with the Northern Pacific Railroad and caused a financial collapse that ruined Grant's administration and started off a 7-year depression. Chase was in a pickle with Cook because Cook was quite brazenly courting not only the business of being the bond seller for the Treasury, but also the profit that he would earn from selling these bonds. In one of his first letters to Chase, he said, proposing that Chase hire him to sell Treasury bonds. He said, of course we would expect that the profit, which a good salesman could only expect would be his, some very obsequious language, as if he were doing the union a great favor by coming in and working to sell bonds. He was Philadelphia, he set up a branch of his business more or less across the street from the Treasury, just in case, and put his brother to work there, just so Chase would get the message. He had Chase and his daughters. Chase was a widower, so he was looking. He was quite hard pressed during the war for a place to put the girls, so would take care of them, and Cook would have them in over holidays when there was a bad virus going around in Washington. He put them up. He was very kind to Cook. He took the Chase, gave him financial advice, and so on. You see Chase in their letters back and forth. He's quite aware that it's unseemly to be taking certainly financial advice and other favors from his biggest client. But on the other hand, he really needs it, and it really completely crosses the line as anything corrupt. And Cook was enormously successful, at least during the Civil War. And he did go door to door. He had agents and all over. He had newspapers hawking his bonds, and he would take out ads in the papers, and then he would threaten the editors that if they didn't also write positive news stories, he'd pull the ads. So he was pretty clever in the ways of journalism. Yes?
Were states also issuing bonds before the national system?
Yes,
started?
states, the question is, were states issuing bonds? Cook actually sold bonds for Pennsylvania. Various states sold bonds. When the war began, it really wasn't clear. The troops were raised by the states. Various states bought their own uniforms. There were early battles where people weren't really sure who they were shooting at because of the difference in uniforms. And there are complaints from various Union generals and supply officers that they were having to compete against parallel efforts in the states. And the states' rights, states' independent traditions were strong in the South, but they were strong in the North too. They were strong in the whole country. That was, how the United States had been organized. Gradually that faded in the North as the Lincoln government sort of took over. In the South, that tradition and that preference continued. When the income tax was legislated, someone suggested that they had state, they feared it would be very, just put everybody off, to have federal officers go door to door assessing and collecting taxes. So there was a suggestion that the states send the people to collect it. Thaddeus Stevens, the Pennsylvania congressman, shot that down. He noted that the government they were fighting to protect had been formed after the collapse of the Articles of Confederation, which had failed notably to form a financial whole, he wrote. And they shouldn't make the same mistake. They shouldn't be ashamed of, this was a federal war, they were fighting for the whole country. And as Stevens put it, will there be any more collectors if they were employed by the federal government rather than the states? Will they be any more odious? But the South didn't see it that way. After all, the whole idea of a federal tax enrichment of a federal infrastructure was kind of the reason why there was a confederacy. So the very minor taxes which they did legislate were supposed to be collected by the states. I say supposed to be because most states didn't even bother to take a tax roll or much less collect it, which was part of the problem. Yes?
We have a question from the Zoom audience. If Chase hadn't been available to be Secretary of Treasury, who would Lincoln have chosen?
Well, that's, that's a hypothetical, so I guess I can say anybody. The person he went to, Chase finally got on Lincoln's nerves one time too often, and resigned for the fourth time in the mid-1864, really when the war was a low point, the finances were a low point, and Lincoln was so relieved at the thought of having this guy out of his hair that he said, "I accept." And Chase, what do you mean? We've done this dance before. But, and Lincoln first, not all of Lincoln's nominations and appointments were very considered. He first, because he had to fill Chase's shoes in a hurry, he picked an Ohio named Todd, who just had knew nothing about the finances. He declined it. And then he immediately goes to William Fessenden, who's chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. He certainly knew a lot about the finances. Fessenden was getting on in years. He's sort of worn down by, I think, his responsibilities. He also turned it down, but Lincoln said, "I'm sending your name up, and you're going to have to turn it down in open if you do it." So he became the Secretary of the Treasury for most of the rest of the war. I suspect that he would have been the best choice had Chase not been available, because he was, John Sherman was another possibility, who became Secretary of the Treasury after the war, but
What prompted Lincoln to appoint Chase Chief Justice?
so that's a great question. Chase is named Chief Justice when Roger Taney, the infamous Roger Taney, the author of the Dred Scott decision, dies in August of 1864. Lincoln knew that Chase had been out of office for a couple of months, was convinced that he wouldn't be president this time, was angling for it. But he sat and waited till the election because he didn't want his decision to influence the election. Obviously, then as now, the choice of a Chief Justice could be politically sensitive. But there were two items on the agenda that Lincoln really cared about. Items that, administrative acts of his that he was afraid might come before the court. First, of course, was the Emancipation Proclamation. The 13th Amendment was not law. So the only thing that had freed the slaves was this proclamation in wartime, and the legality, the enforceability of it, wasn't known. He said he did it as an act of war, but where does it say in the Constitution what you can do as an act of war? Does it say you can take away people's property? Anyway, it didn't even affect, of course, slaves in the Union states. But Lincoln knew that Chase, as a really committed, as I said, anti-slavery warrior, would defend the Emancipation Proclamation. And the other was the Legal Tender Act. Chase had used greenbacks to fund the administration. He has put his own picture, not coincidentally, on the $1 note, which is the one that circulated most widely. And so he felt that Chase would be a good Chief Justice, although a few of his confreres said to him, "What are you doing picking this guy? He's just going to use the court as a launching pad to run for president again." And Lincoln said, "Well, if he cannot do that, he'll be a good Chief Justice, and if not, forget it." Of course, Chase did do that. He ran for president again in 1868 while he was sitting Chief Justice, and then had it blind again before he died in 1872. And the interesting thing is that the Legal Tender Act did come up before Chase, and he voted against it. He nullified it. I think out of some, I suspect, lingering pique that Lincoln was more associated with the measure than he was, and there were 2 vacant seats in the court. Legal tender, of course, was circulating it. Chase was part of a 4-3 majority in validating legal tender. Grant hardly named 2 more justices, and in a similar case, very quickly after, that decision was reversed and legal tender was affirmed. Yes?
Could you speak a little more about the financial thinking of the South? Was it failure to have right people, failure of imagination, magical thinking that they just thought this whole
I
thing
think
would work?
magical thinking is a really good term. And I say that advisedly. We've all seen what control over a commodity cartel has done to Vladimir Putin in wartime. Obviously, he thought he could get away with literally murder thanks to his control of natural gas going to Germany and so on, other countries in Central Europe. And certainly the war has been more difficult for him than he anticipated. Something similar possessed the South. First in the antebellum years, there's a famous comment from Senator Hammond in South Carolina that cotton is king, no one dares make war in the South. And they believed this. They thought that neither the North, which needed cotton for their mills and for foreign exchange, nor Europe, which had a huge textile industry, would permit an enduring war in the South. And textile, this is the 1860s, the Industrial Revolution is in its 2nd or 3rd decade, and the Industrial Revolution began with textiles. They were the first big industry. They employed hundreds of thousands in Lancaster, in Lyon, and so on. When the war starts, Judah Benjamin, one of Jefferson Davis's advisors, urges his government to ship all the cotton they could to England right away. The Union didn't nearly have enough ships to blockade the South. It hadn't even declared the blockade. And this would allow them to just sort of peel off cotton and sell it as the need arose and provide for a fairly lengthy war. First, he was scoffed at. This isn't going to be a long war. One of the other people in his cabinet said, if there's any bloodshed, I'll be able to wipe it clean with my handkerchief. He actually said that. They came up with another plan. You mentioned magical thinking, and the idea was, why don't we just withhold our cotton voluntarily? They thought this would so put the European cotton producers in such desperate straits that they would intervene and stop the war. And the South did this for the better part of a year plus, when they could have shipped cotton, all day and all night. Of course, they never answered. They never thought about how exactly the Europeans were going to intervene, if they chose to intervene. Were they going to bring armies and ships here? Were they really going to confront the United States? Why would that be? And so on. And by the time that they realized this policy wasn't working and began to ship cotton, the North had a semblance of a blockade. The South couldn't then send cotton out in large ships. They had to use these little fleet runners, which would go to island ports. From the island ports, the Brits would ship it under their own flag back to Europe. But the South's ability was already greatly constrained in terms of the tonnage that they could ship. And it was magical thinking.
Could you speak a bit about the average Union soldier? How were they paid? Were they paid in greenbacks? And was that an effective recruiting tool for recruiting more soldiers?
Well, they were paid in greenbacks. They were paid in various notes, and when the greenbacks came along, they were paid in greenbacks. One of the most effective recruiting tools was a letter that was written by a Union soldier to his wife from a southern prison camp, asking her to invest his greenbacks in Union bonds. I said they're a good investment. They'll prepare for you and for the kids well. He was soon to be executed, as he knew. This story went public. Of course, the Union used it to their great advantage. Let's see. Nonetheless, the Union did need a draft, or felt they needed a draft. So, although they continuously fell behind in paying the troops, even with the greenbacks. For that reason, they kept having to issue more greenbacks, despite having said at the beginning there would only be one issue of them. I suspect it wasn't just the form of pay that discouraged people from joining up. There were all sorts of reasons. I'm sure you know about the draft riots. And, one of the things that potentially discouraged troops was the propaganda from Democratic Party politicians that they were just going to be, in effect, expendable troops to go free black slaves and throwing their lives away for, I won't use the term that these propagandists used. But the Union, particularly in 1863, had a good deal of trouble getting all the soldiers to war.
Can you say anything about the extent to which confiscated Confederate funds and property, held in the North contributed to the funding of the war by the North?
I don't think there weren't many confiscations. I don't think it contributed much. What contributed, the South stopped paying its bills to the North in November, December or so of 1860, before the war began, and really tipped off a depression in the North. What contributed was a very dubious policy of Lincoln's and Chase's. As the Union armies went south, they began to buy cotton in occupied Southern territory, occupied by the North. They set this whole complicated system of licensing so-called loyal Southern brokers or traders, traders with a D, not traders, although the line became very blurry. And the idea was that if you were a Southerner and you pledged loyalty to the Union, it was okay for you to sell cotton to the North, which the North needed very much. Inevitably, the funds moved from Union-occupied areas into the South generally, into the coffers of the Confederacy. Inevitably, there's no way of really knowing who was loyal Southerner and who wasn't. The populations in these areas were basically rampantly anti-Union, no matter what people said. And Grant and Sherman, General Sherman, were livid about this policy. Grant said you can't fight with the people and trade with them at the same time. It's kind of obvious. And it was a mistake. And it went on, and then Lincoln's papers are filled with letters, even from Mary Todd's relatives, asking them to be named as licensed for traders and everything, traders. And it was just a bad policy.
After the war, over here. Okay, after the war, the Supreme Court at some point, I think in the 1870s, declared the income tax unconstitutional. Was Chase dead by then, or what? How would he have ruled? I mean, how could he? I mean, it looks pretty on the face. It was a pretty direct violation of the constitutional prohibition of that kind of tax. So how would Chase have reacted if that case had come to him while he was still there?
So what happened was, after the war, the Union had two ongoing streams of revenue. One was the income tax, which was producing $400 million or so a year, and the other was the tariff. The trade resumed during the war and continued after, which contributed a little bit less. But together, those were more than the country needed. They weren't fighting war anymore. And so the idea was, let's get rid of one of them. And it was quite a battle because the sort of egalitarians amongst the Republican Party. The Republican Party had been an egalitarian party, had been a new, very progressive party, wanted to keep the income tax and get rid of the tariff, which was very sectionally biased against farming areas and for manufacturing areas, and very much a Wall Street pro-tax. Wall Street felt the other way, so they got rid of the income tax. Not surprising, they kept the tariff, which became the mainstay of the Republican Party. That became a more corporate-centric party. It wasn't until the Democrats were in power in 1894 under Grover Cleveland that they reinstated the income tax. At that point, it was challenged in the court and nullified, and then returned when the amendment ratifying the income tax passed under Woodrow Wilson. And time for one more, I think. John?
Yeah, we're not the Confederate problem, and the Confederate bonds, they were backed by cotton, and they couldn't sell the cotton, so made the bonds not worth it.
So John raises the issue of the Confederate bonds backed by cotton, and this was another example of magical thinking. In late 1862, early 1863, a financier from France pitched an idea to Confederacy, which was, what about we float bonds backed by the Confederacy and backed by Confederate cotton for marks, for pounds, for francs, and so on. And people can you can just give them the cotton at the end of the war. Believe it or not, in Europe, they thought this was a terrific idea because they offered them a premium. In other words, they offered the amount you get back in cotton was worth more than the face value of the bonds. Of course, there were two problems with this theory. One was that after the war, presumably the price of cotton would go back down because it wouldn't be a scarcity. But the larger problem was that after the war, there might be no Confederate government to repay the bonds. And there were actually people who argued in Britain, legal theories that the Union would be beholden to redeeming these bonds, regardless of who won. Remarkably, they traded at a higher price than Union bonds quite late through the middle of 1864. Today, they're worth nothing except their souvenir value, as you say. So I want to thank you all for coming.
We have a little gift for you. Everybody, thank you very much.
Just one, pick one.
So we have two microphones, so you should be able to hear me. Thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you to Roger Lowenstein for being our speaker. One more hand of applause for